Well, good morning. This is Plant Smart Living with Farmer Fred. Really glad you could join me today out here in the garden. And it's a beautiful day here in early April. We've really had a lot of snow here this winter, a lot of rain, and we just had 10 inches of snow on March 21st. And so, you know, the garden season is starting off pretty slow. But anyhow, today I wanted to start a two-part series. Part one would be 5 garden mistakes to avoid for beginner gardeners. And the second one would also be the same, 5 more garden mistakes to avoid for beginner gardeners. And so I'm really looking forward to doing those videos. So thanks for joining me today out here in the vegetable garden. So like I mentioned earlier, we're like the first week of April here in Pennsylvania Zone 6. And so, you know, our garden's been at rest here for the last 5-6 months. And so now that it's springtime, it's now season 4 of our Plant Smart Living garden season. And so, you know, I have a lot of exciting videos to do and lined up. And, you know, I just thought that going over garden mistakes to avoid for the beginner gardener would be some good topics. I've been gardening now for 25 plus years, and you know, through those years there's a lot of trials and errors, there's been a lot of failures, there's been a lot of successes, but you know, you learn through your trials and errors, through your failures, and then you just continue to move on. But gardening is one big learning curve. And so I thought, well, for beginner gardeners, if you can learn what mistakes to avoid in your garden, it's going to make your garden season a lot easier. And it's not only going to make your garden season a lot easier, it's going to make it a lot more enjoyable. You know, the garden practices that I've developed over the years have just really made my garden season a lot more enjoyable, with less weeding to do and not worrying about pesticides and all. So, you know, that's what you want. You want to be able to enjoy your time out here in the garden. You know, now that it's springtime, I can hear the birds starting to chirp and everything. And so it's a really enjoyable time to be outside in the garden. So anyhow, number 1 of 5 garden mistakes to avoid for beginner gardeners is to start small and build off your successes. In other words, avoid designing your garden or building your garden too large or too big for the first time. Like right behind me where I'm sitting is my 18-foot by 30-foot raised garden bed. That was my initial garden that I started with, but I had already been gardening before and was quite familiar with it, so I started out with this size. And the problem with starting out with a garden that's too large is that it can become overwhelming. You know, there's a lot of knowledge to take in, and it's a lot of hands-on experience. And so what I would recommend is to start small and build off your successes. Now, a couple years ago, I built and installed a raised garden bed for my daughter. It was only one 4-foot by 8-foot raised garden bed, and within that raised bed I put a couple tomato plants in, a couple pepper plants, a couple maybe one basil plant, and then some greens that we planted. And she was just amazed at how much produce that one small garden bed produced. But it was something that was easily managed, and even with starting small like that, you're going to have some trials and errors that you're going to go through. You could even just have maybe 2 4-foot by 8-foot raised beds if you wanted something a little bit larger. But the idea is just not to overwhelm yourself, the first season, because if you overwhelm yourself and frustrate yourself, then you may just give up with gardening altogether. So for me, I would just avoid starting and making the mistake of starting too large. Number 2 on the list would be, as they say in the real estate world, location, location, location. So once you've decided what size garden you want to install in your yard, you want to make sure that you locate your garden in the proper location. For instance, right behind me, and in most of my garden, or all of my garden, I should say, really gets full sunlight, a good 8 hours a day. But right behind me here in this bed, I grow my peppers and my tomato plants and my basil plants, my eggplant. But they all like a good 8 hours of sunlight. In other words, anything with a root or a fruit. A root, for instance, like a potato or a carrot, again, in your peppers and your tomatoes, they all like a good 6 to 8 hours of sunlight. And I always say the more, the better. And so you really want to keep that in mind when you go to install your garden in your yard. All your greens, like your kale, your Swiss chard, your collard greens, they all can get away with 4 to 6 hours of sunlight. So knowing that information, you can locate your garden accordingly. But I would recommend going out in your yard and observing where the sun is. You could even mark the ground where the soil or where the sun might hit certain areas of your yard, or even if you grow in pots on your patio or your balcony, you want to make sure you have proper sunlight for certain vegetables. And so that's really a good tip to remember. But you do want to avoid growing and planting your vegetables in the wrong spot. That would be number 2 on the list, is avoid planting them in the wrong spot. Like a couple years ago, I did an experiment and I planted some tomatoes in the shade just to see what would happen. Well, they grew some. They were very leggy. Everything looked just unhealthy, because they were in the wrong spot. There were a few tomatoes that developed, but they just didn't get the proper sunlight that they required. Number 3 on the list would be avoid planting your vegetables in the existing soil in your yard if it's too much clay or too many rocks, or if it's too sandy, for instance. And so what you would want to do is you could just dig a hole, maybe 1 foot deep, and check your soil out, see how much topsoil there is, how much clay, and go from there. But you could, if you dig down about 1 foot, you can look at the profile of your soil. Is the area, is it too wet? And so if that's the case, you may want to consider using raised beds, because raised beds have a lot of benefits to them. And that's what I have here in our Plant Smart Living gardens. I fill my raised beds with the composted leaf mulch that's amended with topsoil, and that's basically certified weed-free, but the plants just grow and thrive in that area. And so you really want to take some time up front and check your existing soil conditions. So number 4 on the list would be avoid creating too much work for yourself. In other words, keep it simple. So now that you've found a location for your garden, you've decided what size of garden and maybe what type of soil you're going to use inside your garden, whether you're going to mend the existing soil that you have or build a raised bed and fill it with some soil or some compost that you can control now. You need to plant something in there. And so, right now in my garden, in some of my beds right now, I have some seeds that I planted about a week and a half ago. I direct sowed some spinach in there. There's some red beets. I have some lettuce in there. I have some curly leaf kale. But I also, once the warmer weather comes too, I also use transplants and seedlings. From Ray's greenhouse over in Telford, I buy some seedlings and transplants with my job and everything too, I have a fairly busy schedule. I don't always have time to sow some seeds indoors for my garden, but over there at Ray's Greenhouse, I can get those seedlings and transplants for a really good price. And so it keeps things simple here in our gardens, and I would encourage you as a beginner gardener to also do the same thing. Until you really get familiar with your garden, you could just buy seedlings and transplants. And if you do go to a local nursery, it's always good to pull the plant out of the little pot and make sure the plant's not root bound, where it's not being strangled with roots. If that's the case, the plant was in the container too long, you may want to make sure you choose some different transplants. But anyhow, in the first season or two, I would think about just keeping things simple and just buy some seedlings and transplants for your garden. So number 5 on the list would be avoid planting your plants or your vegetables too close together. For instance, behind me here, I have my tomatoes and my peppers. And the mistake you can make is planting everything too close together. It doesn't allow for air circulation, which could promote disease or fungus. You want those plants to be able to breathe. But right behind me, I have my peppers here in my 6 mil black polyethylene plastic. But those plants are anywhere from, my green bell pepper plants, they're anywhere from 24 to 28 inches apart. And the rows are probably 3 feet apart, so you can walk down the aisles. And then my tomato plants are probably 30 inches apart. Because my plants they really grow large and healthy, and they just thrive in this garden bed underneath. They like warm feet, and so they thrive under this 6 mil polyethylene plastic. But you do want to make sure for your tomatoes, even for your melons and all, they can really spread out pretty far. You want to make sure you have at least another 4 or 6 feet beyond your raised garden bed for those vines to be able to stretch out. Now, when you plant your greens, greens, you can plant them a lot closer together. But even on my greens, some of those Swiss chard and kale plants, they get huge. And so even those I plant about 12 inches on center. Now you can plant them all a lot closer together, your greens, but they may end up they're going to choke each other out to some degree. You're not going to get the air circulation. They also will stay smaller. You may have more leaves, but they'll be a little bit smaller, which is okay too. But on the average, I try to plant my greens about 12 inches apart. Again, and you just want to make sure that you have more spacing for your tomatoes, for your eggplant, for your peppers. Again, they're going to definitely need some more area to grow. So anyhow, I hope this video on 5 garden mistakes to avoid will be helpful for you. If you have any questions or comments about this video, feel free to leave them in the comment section below. And you can also visit us at plantsmartliving.com. And there you can learn more about gardening and also how you can reclaim your health by adopting a whole food, plant-based, vegan lifestyle. Well, anyhow, I hope you have a wonderful day today. So until next time, this is Plant Smart Living with Farmer Fred.